toxicity in League of Legends is the #1 talked about point whenever somebody discusses League, both from Riot, the League community, and the community from outside of League of Legends in gaming itself. Toxicity in League is the thing that you'll always hear people talking about how things can be made to be less toxic, how toxic the League community is, and all of this ultimately stems from a few things. One of them is the base structure of League of Legends and how it operates as a game, and then also Riot's framing to frame every single thing that they could ever possibly put in the game through the lens of toxicity. So first off, let's talk about the structure of League and how that cultivates toxicity. If you compare it to other esports games like Counter-Strike or Valorant, League has no round-based system like those games. And round-based systems would allow you to have a break in between every round so that you have a little bit of a cool-off point. Whereas in League, you'll be stuck in a game for 40, 50, potentially even 60 minutes, where the pressure is just constantly building up and up and up, and there is no pressure release valve there. And with no pressure release valve, that will just inherently make people potentially be more toxic. Another thing is that in League of Legends, compared to other games, other people performing poorly on your team directly influences how much you are able to have an impact on the game. It would be like if in CSGO, if your teammates were dying, it made the enemy's guns stronger. That doesn't exist in those games, but it exists in League. So if somebody on your team is not doing well and they're just beating the enemy bot laner or the enemy top laner or something, that directly influences your ability to have fun or to actually do anything within the game. And that aspect of snowballing is inherently going to make League more toxic. And then also, how much of there is this kind of concept of being held hostage, where if there are two people who are just not surrendering a game where nothing is going right, you're obviously not going to win, but it might take them 10, 15, 20 minutes to end. You're being forced into a game that there won't necessarily be any value derived from. These kind of fundamental aspects about League will make it naturally more toxic than any other game that exists. So with that out of the way, there's also the concept of how Riot frames everything around toxicity. So first off, Riot at one point didn't want to have sandbox mode in the game or practice tool in the game because they said it would create toxicity. Here's this post right here from a Rioter 5 years ago, where basically they said the reason that they didn't want to implement practice tool is because it would make people more toxic. And Riot does this consistently with any kind of basic feature in the game, where if they think, even if the feature is going to be an amazing feature for the game and increase people's enjoyment of the game tenfold, if they think it will increase toxicity by 1%, they just won't do it. Because ultimately, from Riot's point of view, having a game where people are not toxic is the most important thing from Riot's point of view. And overwhelmingly, from most players' point of view, they don't necessarily care about toxicity as much as Riot does. They care about game-ruining behaviors, like soft feeding, or intentionally running it down, or these kind of things that actually affect how the game plays out. Whereas there is no solution for that, but there is a solution for somebody being toxic, which is to mute them. That's always been the case in League, and Riot's just not necessarily done anything to fix that. And then the next point to go into is, why is Riot so fixated on toxicity when that's not the general conception of most people by default? And that would be going over to who created the system of toxicity the system and philosophy of toxicity that exists within League today. And that would be somebody known as Riot Light. Riot Light was you can look more into it, but basically, TLDR, Riot Light cheated on 4 different women, one of them being a rioter, and he also sued his ex-fiance to get the ring back. So he is not a particularly good person, and he was the head of toxicity and player behavior in League of Legends when it first was conceptualized. And so the person who created the system of like smiting people, of banning people for toxic words, and making Riot frame everything through the lens of toxicity was somebody who, in and of themselves, was not a good person in any capacity or form. And Riot Light also, coincidentally, works for Facebook now. And so it kind of makes sense that it would seem like he'd be somebody who would want to influence people's perceptions and influences people's like minds and gameplay, which is ultimately what Riot is trying to do. Riot wants to change who you are as a person to try to make you less toxic. And that's something that they've always kind of strived to do. They want to influence how you act as a person. And that has been something from Riot through the start. And that's something that Riot has gotten worse and worse at over time. Like, another example of how the functional game increases toxicity is surrender votes. In games like Dota, another MOBA, surrender votes don't necessarily exist. If you think that the game is going to be done, like there's no chance of winning, you will just open the game. You will just, everybody sit in the fountain and not play the game so the enemy can win. Or the enemy can just quickly win. And big reasons why that causes toxicity is you will have people just spam surrender vote as they're the one person, and that there's the pressure in the boiler tank of players' mentals, and every time you would see a surrender vote of somebody saying FF, that increases the toxicity over time, and it will get larger and larger. But yeah, going back to the point of Riot framing practice tool as being something that would influence toxicity, which they eventually went back on because there was enough of a pushback. There's the concept of voice chat causing toxicity. Riot thinks that adding voice chat to League will make the game more toxic, and so that's ultimately the reason why they don't have voice chat. The technology exists. They have League voice in the client, so you can talk to people who are in your party, but you can't talk to people who are solo queued with each other. The thing with that is that voice chat is something that exists in Valorant, which is another Riot game, but doesn't exist in League. And a big reason for that is that Valorant is trying to leech players from CSGO, just purely my opinion. So they need to have a certain base amount of features to allow them to actually get those players. Because they could totally argue that voice chat is going to be something that leads to toxicity in Valorant, so we're not going to have it in the game. And another aspect of how toxicity used to be dealt with, even during the Riot Light days, that they eventually went back on, because of reasons that we'll talk about later, is the tribunal system. Now, the tribunal system was basically a concept of being judged by your peers, which is how most modern judicial systems work today, is where you are put into a trial in front of your peers and they will determine whether or not you deserve a punishment. And the thing about that is that gives Riot less control over their ability to influence player behavior, because then it's ultimately crowdfunding what is considered toxic, and so toxicity is based off of what players think is toxic or game-ruining behavior. Like, this is the line where it's too far. Whereas players might have the line being too far being right here, but Riot's line for being too far is right here, where it's just so much lower. And Tribunal also creates a kind of a skin in the game, where there was the idea of maybe you had a bad day of solo queue. There are a bunch of people who are flaming. Go into the tribunal and blow off some steam. And that'll also help you kind of have the idea of being a little bit less toxic because you feel like you can do something about it. And just the feeling of being able to do something about it, even if it's not necessarily working as well, like dramatically increases the well-being of the players and will make people who are the ones who are most impacted by toxicity feel like they're actually able to do something. And with the whole another aspect of the whole voice chat in Valorant is that there are many features in Wild Rift and Valorant that are wanted in League that exist in these other games but don't exist in League. One example would be role select. In Wild Rift, in Ranked, you have a role preference for your top roles and then your bottom roles. So let's say you never want to play jungle. You can have jungle as your 5th role and then have it a descending order of where your list is going to be. Whereas in League now, you just have your first role and your 2nd role. And that is just something that inherently creates toxicity because autofill creates toxicity. When Riot introduced role select, it allowed people to, by and large, one-trick roles, where somebody could be somebody who just plays mid lane, or they can be somebody who just plays AD carry, or just plays jungle. Whereas before role select in League, you had to play multiple roles to a certain level. You had to be competent enough to play maybe a jungle champion. Even if you don't necessarily play jungle, play a simple jungler, play a mid laner, have a top lane pick that you can play, have a support that you can play, have an AD carry you can play. Because these were the requirements for climbing. And because Riot introduced role select, now people have severe gaps in their gameplay between their primary roles and their secondary roles. So what this causes is games where, even though the games are balanced on an MMR basis, they're wildly unbalanced because me, as an example, I'm a challenger mid-Tryndamere player. If I'm put on a jungle role and I don't get Tryndamere, I'm made to play AD carry, not on Tryndamere, I'm not going to perform to a challenger level. Whereas if role select didn't exist, I would have to be forced to play all roles to a challenger level to actually achieve challenger. So that's also another aspect of one-tricks. One-tricks are allowed to exist because role select exists. And that leads to tons of toxicity where people are playing things that they aren't comfortable with. Another concept of Riot focusing so much on toxicity, even to the point to where it's affecting game balance, is comeback mechanics. Comeback mechanics are something that Riot may not admit, but is something that is pretty much just put in to try to prevent toxicity in some sense. Of the idea that Riot wants is that every game is winnable at every point. Even if you have 3 inhibs down, you're 10k gold down, Riot wants you to feel like you can always win a game. And that leads to a ton of toxicity because there's this mismatch between people's perceptions of how winnable a game is. Somebody can see that the game has maybe a 2% chance of being won. Some people think there's a 0% chance of being won. Some people might think it's like 30% chance to be won. And comeback mechanics and the way of reducing snowballing makes it to where there's going to be more disagreements with that and how it makes people just become more toxic because it influences how people think about the game. And Riot just always likes the underdog story, especially because they're based in NA. NA as a region is a region that always likes the underdog story. North America will sacrifice everything for an underdog story. You could have SKT in Season 5, one of the most dominant league teams to exist. And North American fans would love it if SKT lost to like a Southeast Asian region or some random no-name team to get kicked out of the tournament. And it would completely ruin League's history and ruin the legacy of Faker. And that's something that people would like, because at least it's an underdog story. At least it's a massive upset where, in this moment, the little guy won. And that's just a concept that's really, really big in NA culture. Which is another thing, is that Riot's conception of toxicity is really just trying to bring North American contemporary culture and values into the rest of the world, and kind of just forcing Los Angeles ideas onto everybody. And that's just a whole separate point, could be made in an entirely new video. Another point is content creators creating toxicity is a concept that's talked about ad nauseum on places like Reddit, where too many fans and people who have issues with toxicity, the number one thing that they'll be talking about is that content creators create toxicity, where because Tyler 1 gets frustrated in his games, that causes Joe Schmo and Silver to get flamed in his games. Because the argument is that they see Tyler 1 flaming and it's okay, they're not getting banned, so they must think it's okay in their game. The problem with that is that, first off, most people who play League do not consume League content. Most people don't watch YouTube videos like this. Most people don't watch Tyler 1 streams. Or, as an example, with like Solar Renekton only. He's somebody who's very toxic in games when you get him, but his YouTube channel is going to be much more positive, and more people watch YouTube than watch Twitch. The casual League of Legends player might maybe watch World Championships. Maybe they'll watch the finals. They'll watch maybe the playoffs for their region, but they don't actually consume tons of League of Legends content. That's not what the majority of people do. And the same reasons that make content creators like TF Blade, like Tyler 1 toxic, quote unquote, is the same reason that is going to make the silver player be toxic at your level. Because fundamentally how League works is going to make a normal person become toxic. Like, even the nicest person, League will often just make them be toxic because of how many structures there are in the game and how Riot's kind of put so much focus into the wrong areas that create more toxicity. Because the only thing that Riot cares about is chat toxicity and flaming, they've completely neglected other areas that make people become frustrated. And because the areas that cause the most frustration haven't been addressed, it makes people become more toxic. Like, if somebody is running it down in my game with mid-Nunu Ghost Cleanse, oftentimes they won't get banned, and if I flame them, I will get banned. An example of a player who did this was Grandmaster Artis, was a man who streamed 12 hours in high elo solo queue, where he was picking Ghost Cleanse every single game for 12 hours. And he would not get banned. Every single lobby would dodge because people were trying to avoid him, because he was constantly running down every single game that he would get in, and he wasn't punished for 12 plus hours. Pretty much an entire day of solo queue was completely ruined by one person. And anybody could do this at any point, because as long as you don't chat, it's really, really hard to get banned. But game-ruining behaviors like what this person did are not focused on as much by Riot as behaviors that just as like chat flaming. Those are the things that Riot wants to care about the most. Yeah, Riot focuses so much energy towards chat behavior and not necessarily game-ruining behavior. And that kind of goes into that feedback loop that we talked about. But another thing is that there are tools to prevent chat toxicity that have always existed in League from the very start, but there's no way to mute inting. If somebody's running it down in my game, there's no way I can just mute them. Whereas if somebody is flaming me, or there's somebody who's making me become frustrated, I can just mute them and not listen to them. There's two different servers, NA and EU, and on the NA server, oftentimes you'll have sort of passive-aggressive flame where people are trying to get around the system, where if you don't say certain trigger words, you won't get banned. An example of that for me is that if I ever want to flame somebody, I'll just call them a vegan, you know? Everybody knows what I mean, and everybody knows that I'm flaming them by calling them a vegan, or I'll tell them to post physique. But I'll never get banned for that, because I'm not using the particular trigger words that they'll talk about. And so one thing about the toxicity is that oftentimes, at least for me and for most people that I've interacted with, passive aggressiveness is way more frustrating than somebody just telling, like, saying particular things about my mom or something. Because it's that idea that you know that they're not going to get banned for saying that. Whereas if somebody tells, like, my mom to get a particular disease, they're probably going to get banned. But there's that feeling of powerlessness that Riot has created. And with game-ruining behavior not being changed, people can also just kind of softly ruin the game, where they'll take a fight and they'll try to bait in their team to a fight that doesn't work, and then they'll just maybe miss an ability or not use an ability that'll just completely ruin the game intentionally. And they're not doing this because they're not doing this in good faith, they're doing it in bad faith. And these kind of things don't get banned, and they're the most frustrating things. Whereas a counterexample is the European West server. The European West server is way more directly toxic than NA. However, people will still often try, even though they're flaming you. They'll say something like they want to do things to your mother, and they hope your entire family has things happen to them. But then they'll still be trying in the game. And that's something that you can deal with. You can just mute them, and then there's nothing else to actually have to worry about. Because as long as they're playing the game, what does it matter? And another aspect is that Riot's framing around toxicity causes the entire community to frame things around toxicity. Where if a player in professional play is toxic in solo queue, they might think that that person is a bad teammate, or that this person shouldn't really be allowed to exist. Riot's conception is that everybody should be perfectly nice and good all of the time, despite all of these causes for toxicity that Riot has created and how the game has operated. Riot still expects you to never say anything bad ever. And that's, to some degree, how the community conception is. Whereas if a streamer, if anybody says anything toxic in any game, all of a sudden they're just a bad person. And Riot is the controller of the frame of the argument. And since they frame everything around toxicity, like why we can't have voice chat, why we couldn't have practice tool, they're ultimately the controllers. They're the ones in command. So that line of thinking, that philosophy, just trickles down to everybody else. And once again, the creator of this current system is not necessarily the best person. Players get around these behaviors by doing behaviors that ruin the game even more. And another aspect is that players don't have a pressure release valve from flaming. Flaming is often a way where people can let out their frustrations about what's happening. And since it's being let out, it's not boiling up into going into other aspects. If somebody can flame somebody in chat, that might make it to where they're less likely to intentionally ruin the game, gameplay-wise. Because without having that pressure release valve of flaming somebody in game, they might just run it down because they know they won't get banned for running it down, but they'll get banned for flaming, you know? So all of these concepts are just why Riot's framing around toxicity has just completely ruined League. And it's completely changed how everybody kind of thinks of everything. And it's just not a good time. But yeah, that is the main points of the video. Let me know what you guys think. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. What do you guys think about me making these kind of like talking videos that exist? Let me know what you guys think down below. I want to do a lot more of these because this is the kind of content that I would personally like to watch. And so I maybe see if there's any other people who want to watch it. Next video might be on how you can sort of improve your own mental. Within the framing of toxicity, if you have any issues with that, or how you can use your own mental to improve yourself in the game. Yeah, see you guys all in the next video. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye and good night.